We are now joined by Max Levine. He's the co founder and CEO of Nico, a neighborhood investment company that makes it possible for people to build a long term financial stake in their community by investing in local real estate. Max, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Max, thanks for joining us. For those who aren't familiar with Nico, can you tell us about what you do and what it means to be a neighborhood investment company?
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess the first thing is we're very much trying to learn and figure out what it means to be a neighborhood investment company. So I'm not sure we totally know yet. But the idea behind Nico is really that we wanted to create a way for everybody within a community, really with an eye towards renters, to be able to build wealth by investing in local real estate in a way that is aligned with people's values when they think about their own neighborhood. And really, what the company and the structure is the structure being a neighborhood real estate investment trust or neighborhood REIT that allows local folks and other investors to invest in a portfolio of income producing properties within a neighborhood, initially here in Echo Park in Los Angeles, starting at $95. And so we're really trying to create a very low threshold for people who have traditionally been excluded from investing in local real estate, usually through a homeownership lens, to be able to do so in partnership with us and in partnership with professional investment capital.
Fantastic. And you mentioned that you're starting in Echo Park in Los Angeles. So, would you mind telling us a little bit more about that project? How did it emerge, and what are you hoping to achieve in Echo Park?
Sure. Yeah. So, we launched Nico Echo Park Benefit Corp, which is the name of the neighborhood REIT, just over a year ago. We launched in March, late March 2020, and so we launched right into the early days of COVID, and so our mission changed very quickly. And I wouldn't say that it was a hard pivot, but it really crystallized for us a lot of the values and the intent that we built the company around. Big picture, what we're hoping to get through this model is, really like a vehicle for broadly held local ownership of real estate. And so we think a lot about the Green Bay Packers. And I don't know if either of you are familiar with the Packers or any of the listeners are, but the
Not their real
Packers are the
estate
old.
investments, but
Well, I don't know. They probably own their stadium, but as a model, as a template, the Green Bay Packers are the only major professional sports team in North America that is actually owned by the community. And so if you think about like, okay, so the city of Green Bay, it's like 100,000 people and it's super cold, right? The Green Bay Packers, on paper, like probably shouldn't have an NFL football team, right? For starters. And, secondly, like they've had the longest home sellout streak. I think they've sold out every home game since the late 50s. Um, and, so if you think about those as being like very differentiated outcomes relative to their peer group, our question is what would happen in terms of outcomes for a community if a neighborhood was actually had a substantial vehicle for, broadly held local ownership. And our theory of change is really around what is the power of community ownership to deliver a different set of materially better financial, social, and environmental outcomes with an eye towards stakeholders in that community, right? And so one of the things we've done in support of that is we've organized Nico Echo Park as something called a benefit corporation, which means that we have an explicit legal and fiduciary responsibility to balance financial returns to our shareholders with the social and environmental impact of the business on stakeholders broadly. And that connects to this idea that, lots of the sort of issues that we view through a lens of sort of participants and people who are excluded, right? And I think gentrification you can view through that lens, and many other issues around development ultimately come down to who participates, who benefits, who is harmed, who is excluded. And we're really looking to realign that whole mechanism of inclusion in a way that really aligns investment capital with, broadly with people in the communities where we are deploying this model.
I wanted to ask you about that because it's interesting. You're talking about Echo Park as a benefit corporation. I think we know that great city neighborhoods are unique. They're unique places, and so I'm curious to hear how you scale Nico's approach when you do go to other neighborhoods, knowing that neighborhood's gonna maybe need something different, have different goals.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we are learning that presently, and I think the main thing is really about um, how do we extend like our model as a tool and a resource that a community can invite there, right? And so, you know, Nico Echo Park was a little unique because it was the first one, and we didn't have sort of a track record of what this model is or who we are as a company that we could sort of point to. I think moving forward, we will seek to bring this model to different neighborhoods in partnership with trusted, established local actors and based on being invited to bring this model by a broad group of stakeholders within that community.
I want to go back a little bit to one of the things you said, which was that you started working in Echo Park during the pandemic, and that kind of influenced the way that you went about your project there. And I'm also thinking too that the pandemic put a lot of strain on housing stability in a lot of cities. And my understanding is that you and Nico provided some rental assistance during the pandemic. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind describing how that program worked and how has it shaped your approach moving forward.
Yeah, we're really proud of that program, and I think just to sort of give a little bit of backstory onto the timeline because it's always helpful. We just came out with our first neighborhood impact report, our 2020 neighborhood impact report, and that report and the sort of work that went into the results that are included in that report are really at the core of the innovation that we're trying to create through this model, right? And so, like, sort of core to that is like there was this big question, that we were wrestling with as a team, and that I think stakeholders in the community and observers and different people like around our company were sort of like, well, what is a neighborhood investment company, and what is a benefit, like how is a benefit corp sort of framework, stakeholder capitalism, triple bottom line framework applied to a neighborhood housing provider, right? And I was talking to one of our advisors like early in the pandemic, and it sort of felt like you know we did a lot of sort of pre-work on establishing like what we call our impact assessment framework, right? And that was created with a lot of stakeholder input, and that's sort of like when you are measuring non like measuring financial results, like there's a way to do that. It's very established. There's accounting standards and public reporting standards and all that stuff. When you're measuring social environmental performance, there are frameworks, but it's less well established, and it's also has to be tailored really to the impact that you're trying to deliver through a business. So we did a lot of pre-work on what that was, and one of the focus, we have 5 focus areas, and one of them is around helping to preserve and enhance neighborhood stability and diversity. And so, you know, COVID happened, and I was having flashbacks to being a real estate investment analyst in 2008, and sort of that moment of panic and uncertainty, and what does this mean, and all that stuff. And like very quickly, we went to what are the human outcomes that people losing their jobs are going to create, which is how am I going to pay my rent? What does that mean for my stability as a renter, and all that stuff. And so the pre-work that we did on our impact assessment framework and on sort of like really trying to establish our values as a company even prior to launching was such that our first act as a public company was to approve this rent assistance program. And the rent assistance program had 3 parts. The first was immediately, and I'm talking in time for April rent cycle, April 2020 rent cycle, we designed an onboarding flow where members of our community, residents and commercial tenants of our buildings, were able to opt in and self-identify hardship as a result of COVID. People lost their jobs or whatever. And the first step in the process was that we released their security deposits, which is their money that we as a housing provider are holding. And so the first thing we did was we made those deposits available to be applied towards rent if somebody opted into the program. by the time the next month came along, we had an additional layer to the program in place, which was that Nico, the sponsor of the REIT, made up to $150,000 of rent assistance grants available to people who had already used their security deposit. And so that was a cash grant assistance fund that was designed to really to minimize the extent to which people ended up owing us money coming out of COVID. Like we were planning around a scenario where maybe it was 6 months, right? So like here we are 15 months later, and and that money went further actually than we thought it would. And then the third part of the rent assistance program is actually has nothing to do with rent, it has to do with our core model, which is that we made $1,000 per household in REIT shares available to our community, right? And so that you'll say, well, what does that do for me if I can't pay my rent? And the answer is like not much, but it is a gesture of partnership, and it is speaking to this attempt that we're making through this model to really realign interests between stakeholders who have at times had like a fairly if you think about the landlord-tenant relationship, like those are words that we are very careful about using, but that's a painful, contentious like dynamic, and resetting that through partnership through this model is a big part of what we're trying to do. And I think this program both helped to express our values in a very tangible way early on, and also helped us as a team like live our values right out of the gate. And that's always helpful when you're trying to build culture and figure out like what your company's about as a startup.
Max, last one, and we'll let you go. You talked a lot about partnership with communities. When you step back and kind of think big picture about the future of cities, the future of neighborhoods, what role do you think private developers should play when it comes to building more equitable places?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we have a major housing shortage, right? Like this housing crisis is, it's really about needing more housing units. I mean, there's some other like elements to it as well. It's not just that, but that's such a big part of it. And so I think, you know, the word developer has become a dirty word, right? That's the truth. That's the reality of what's happened in neighborhoods like Echo Park, right? And there are thousands of neighborhoods where that same dynamic is playing out around the country, right? And so I think there's sort of a knee-jerk reaction to demonize that word and that what a developer is. But the reality is like it's not development itself as a thing that generates housing units and generates other things that needs to change from our perspective. It's the relationship between that development, the benefits of that development, and the outcomes that that development is generating, the relationship between that and people who've been in these neighborhoods and these communities for a long time. And so, I see a future, and I hope for a future where that word is not a dirty word, where development as a process and the people who are running development companies are seen as providing a resource and a tool and a set of outcomes that are helpful to people, in neighborhoods like Echo Park, and that are a big part of the solution to the housing crisis. And so, to us, it's about alignment of interests, and it's about creating ways for that process of development, which is so needed and so necessary, and not going anywhere, frankly, to work with and for communities as opposed to like the perception that they are against or in threat to communities.
Yeah,
That's
great
great.
answer. And
Yeah.
thank you so much for taking the time to tell us more about Nico today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Max.
Thank you both for having me. I really enjoyed it.